Let me know when you started.
Oh, it started.
Okay. All right, I'll start. Hello, everyone. My name is Olivia Chepkevich, and my group is going to break down the book titled Beyond Brutal Passions, Prostitution in Early 19th Century Montreal, written by Marianne Putanen. I don't know if I said that right, but I'll be providing you with a detailed summary to give you all an idea of what we will be discussing. The book begins with an introductory story about a woman by the name Sarah Noxon. She had an experience as a prostitute getting shot at in her left arm and stones thrown at a nearby building. Her experiences demonstrate the classic paradigm of violence between clients and prostitutes. Beyond Brutal Passions is a social history of heterosexual prostitution in the early 19th century Montreal. It focuses on the complicated interactions between women accused of prostitution and their families, neighbors, and representatives of the criminal justice system. It examines the ways in which Montreal women turn to sex commerce as prostitutes and brothel keepers, and a brothel is a house where men visit prostitutes, if you were not sure what that meant, or part time as casual act during a significant time with the changes in work, demographics, and geography. To maintain these good relationships with neighbors and each other, brothel keepers and prostitutes had to negotiate the expected normative behaviors of the different communities in which they lived and worked. Marianne, the author, uses both a quantitative and qualitative approach to argue women's sexual behavior as an expression of agency that was later criminalized by families who sought to correct misbehaving daughters, sisters, and wives. Michael Foucault's work is important on how correcting misbehaving, or is important, excuse me, is important on how people in power sought to reinforce new standards of sexual behavior associated with the development of capitalism. The book also states that the same women who were accused of prostitution encountered and engaged with the criminal justice system in various ways and various consequences. In some cases, neighbors, friends, and families sought out the criminal justice system to discipline prostitutes, and a common insult during this period was to call a woman a whore. The book questions the discourses about women's sexuality and power through the experiences of women who worked in Montreal's sex trade, and it does this by deconstructing the interplay between their experiences and their agency. It brings together histories of the family, community, criminal justice, sexuality, ethnicity, race, gender, and draws upon a rich body of literature by feminist scholars. Women in the past compromised choices and put in strategies within a range of possibilities that varied on things such as social class, ethnicity, and race and marital status. The 1836 grand jury statement about a woman's passions suggests a changing definition of what constituted acceptable behavior and sexuality for women. As people grappled with prostitution, they were linking the drive for opportunity to account for women's work in sex trade. In Montreal, the book shows that prostitution encompassed more than the exchange of money, involving an assortment of relationships and interactions between sex workers, clients, and police that included, among others, sexual coercion. To continue, prostitution has remained a popular subject for historical analysis as a way to deconstruct the process of criminalizing women and their sexuality. The studies in Quebec mainly focus on the experiences of sex workers and their interactions with the criminal justice system. These investigations cover different time periods, which in turn gives us a better understanding of how prostitution has evolved over 100 years, beginning after the mid 19th century. The author, Marianne, systematically consulted all extant criminal court records of the Court of Quarter Sessions pertaining prostitution-related offenses. Marianne approaches criminal justice documents by reading against the grain to locate women's quote-unquote voices and their experiences in order to piece together individual accounts. Over the beginning half of the 19th century, Montreal had a makeover with social, economic, and demographic transformations. To conclude the introduction, it explains the organization of the book since it is divided into two parts. The first part focusing on women who were accused of prostitution-related offenses, and two being the procedures involved in processing these complaints against alleged prostitutes in the criminal justice system. Now I will hand it over to Allison to discuss Chapter 1.
In Chapter 1, we begin to see prostitution start to flourish in Montreal, focusing on local males as most of their clientele. As this started to happen, we saw prostitution in towns as well as the suburbs, and within these towns and suburbs, sex trade started to happen in fields and roadways around the city. Prostitutes transformed daytime promenades into nocturnal sites of solicitation, and instead of isolated places, they integrated them into mixed neighborhoods. As this began, street prostitutes were arrested in even greater numbers by constables because as the word spread, they knew where to patrol. Because they shared urban spaces, the prostitutes then formed close relationships with their neighbors. However, when the neighbors wanted to get rid of their neighbor who was a prostitute, they would voice their complaints. We saw this happening for many reasons too. Sometimes the neighbors would complain about too much noise being made because it puts the safety of the neighborhood at risk, which offended the neighbors. Knowing that they would complain, the brothel keepers had to keep a good relationship with the neighbors because they didn't want to be raided by the police. But with time, the individuals who resided in these areas denounced them more often. Arrests also began to increase within the city because as the police began to regulate a larger variety of areas throughout the city, the amount of arrests of prostitutes increased. In the end, prostitution swarmed the streets of Montreal until finally the city offered soldiers, sailors, immigrants, and residents spaces to meet their demands for drinking and social ability, but mainly focused on sex. This change in turn modified the sexual geography of the city because really people were just looking for somewhere to hang during the summer or a warm place in the winter to gather.
So chapter 2 is called At Home in the Brothel, and it kind of explains what life was like living in these brothels. Buchanan argues that home and brothel were not distinct. They were one and the same. There were families living within the walls, married couples, children, even older folks. Most female brothel keepers tended to be single and francophone, and most male keepers tended to be married and non-francophone. Age is an interesting factor. Most of the prostitutes that are engaging in the sex trade, of course, tended to be younger. That's usually standard, but the owners of these brothels were often older or at least middle-aged. There were many different reasons why women were choosing residential prostitution, but the main reason was to provide for their daily needs and, of course, money. But another reason would be for the social networking aspect of it. Can you switch the slide? Social networking aspect of it, in that when their economic needs weren't being met, even with prostitution, they could use their social networking to meet some of those same needs. Another reason was to avoid problems at home. A lot of these women were coming from abusive households, problems with their marriage, all sorts of things. And this was a way to not only avoid those things, but to create a life for themselves that they could sustain. But life within brothels was, of course, not without issues. There was problems with alcohol use, tuberculosis, diseases, sexually transmitted diseases, of course, theft, assault, all sorts of things that were not being policed well enough in these brothels because, of course, they would have been outed otherwise. And so the brothel, or living in a brothel, came with all sorts of different, pluses and minuses. Next.
Chapter 3 was on prostitution, brothel keepers, and their workplaces. Prostitutes were often found homeless on the streets living in poverty. In most cases, the women lived as a prostitute for a few years until they could find something better. In a few cases, some women lived the majority of their lives in prostitution in and out of jail. Between 1810 and 1829, the number of French-speaking and non-French-speaking women found on the streets were pretty evenly divided, and the French-speaking women came from the states in the countries in the blue. Decades to follow, the number of French-speaking women would drop as the number of non-French-speaking women would rise. Most of the women found on the streets were single, young, Irish, and Catholic women. These Irish women received a lot of backlash as were seen as being near the bottom of the hierarchy of whiteness. Some people thought that they were others within, and so that required civilizing, which meant internalizing the changing values of respectability. A small amount of African women also faced a lot of racial problems because of the long history of slavery. The prostitutes were not aid from most charities because the charities didn't think that they deserved it as prostitutes. In the cold months, without a warm place to live, many of the prostitutes caught colds, hypothermia, and some even froze to death. Prostitutes were often caught stealing food and clothes and searching anywhere for shelter so in many cases, they ended up on farms, sleeping in the barns, and stealing food from the gardens. There were many reasons that women turned to prostitution. Sometimes it was the only way to keep families together. When husbands would depart for the military, women would turn to prostitution to be able to support themselves. And prostitution was a way women could escape homelessness and poverty, although most cases of prostitution would still leave the women homeless and very poor. The results of prostitution were mainly from the rough living conditions, which included malnutrition, tuberculosis, alcoholism, and hypothermia. There were also many unwanted pregnancies due to the lack of safety. Many women were arrested for living on the streets and stealing, but some women also went to jail on their own will to get a shelter or get treated for a venereal disease.
Chapter 4 is about seeking justice. Involving disorderly houses, it was up to the justice of the peace to evaluate the complaint and determine whether or not to issue an arrest warrant. Plaintiffs who decided to abandon the process could use numerous legal and illegal means, the most common being not to appear at the court, which many did. The ambiguities in prostitution laws and the customary practices pertaining to the persecution of those who marketed sex. Another topic was prostitution laws. Prostitution was largely regarded as an offense as brothel inmates or streetwalkers annoyed pedestrians or others disturbed the king's peace, or others being violations of public peace. In 1837, the Special Council reorganized the city police and rewrote a number of laws, some which directly affected street prostitution. The number of arrests began to fall by 1841. Montreal demanded better methods of maintaining social order, which led to fine-tuning of police regulations. Montreal justices revised them to adapt to changing local conditions. Preliminary detention. When a warrant was issued, the police proceeded to a brothel to arrest anyone they found inside the establishments.
Right. Okay. So chapter 5 is about policing prostitution and, more importantly, why they were policed in the first place. And the answer to that has to do with the elite class, the elite rich people at the top. And they're the ones that mainly pushed for the arresting of prostitutes. And it shows in like the kind of people that elites were. They didn't approve of the sex commerce. They didn't approve of homelessness, and they seek to keep their foot on the labor class to keep their status. So, pleasant people. Am I right? But the main thing to know about the jury system at this point is that prostitutes were seen as abominations by the common people, and there was the fact that constables and clergymen made court decisions. So the jury system was very impartial and not in favor of prostitutes. Basically the presence of prostitutes, like just them existing on the streets, pretty much gave elites the idea that these clergymen and these constables weren't doing their jobs correctly. When a prostitute was arrested, they were thrown into jail or correctional facilities. But eventually it was realized that prostitution couldn't be eradicated entirely like they wanted, so they just tried to regulate it at that point. The grand jury pushed for state-regulated brothels, and watchmen were put onto the streets to arrest prostitutes. And the main thing about them is that they were easily identifiable, having watch fur coats, they had staves, they had a rattle, and they had lanterns, because a lot of them were working at night, and in Montreal it's pretty cold. But yeah, because of this, they mainly arrested the night walkers and the people on the streets. They didn't really arrest anybody in brothels without a warrant being issued first. And the thing about the police is that they apparently had high rates of success bringing these people to justice, but little is known about the methods they used, and it's unclear how long they were in effect.
All right, so chapter 6, we talk about more of what happens in the trials of these prostitutes and brothel keepers and the outcomes of their trials in court. So the court system had 6 departments, and when it came to prostitution and brothel owners, the Petty Sessions Department was heavily relied upon. The Petty Sessions Department dealt with lesser crimes, commonly misdemeanors, that were punishable by fines or a short amount of time in prison. Examples of these could have been theft, public intoxication. At the time, abuse was considered a misdemeanor, and as we know, prostitution and brothel keepers fell into this category. So although they both fell into the same category, prostitutes and brothel owners often faced very different sentences and outcomes in their trials. This was heavily due to how the public eye perceived them. Many times outcomes in the courtroom were directly correlated with their reputation. So laboring men at the time were tied to prostitutes, where on the other hand, wealthier men were often connected with brothels due to the idea of having privacy. So this made prostitutes much easier to convict. And although outcomes were different, they had equal opportunity in the courtroom, as well as equal ability to call their own witnesses and delay their trials. So although they had equal opportunity in the courtroom, we commonly saw the trend of brothel keepers finding loopholes within the system. So instead of being convicted and being sentenced to time in prison or fines, many were charged with disruption of peace or peace in their neighborhood. So oftentimes we also saw very well-known people in these communities, families or court officials being involved with prostitution but never being convicted of their crimes. So it wasn't always the case that brothel keepers would get convicted of disruption of peace, and it wasn't always the case that prostitutes would be sentenced to jail time. But many of these defendants had a number of strategies to improve their standings within their trials.
So within Part 7, there was 2 jails focused on, the House of Corrections and the Common Jail. The House of Corrections, it kind of was open sporadically in a way, although people found it important to maintain the morality. The conditions of the prisons were very bad. They were dirty, they were just disgusting in general, and also extremely overcrowded. They didn't really have any, they didn't really separate anybody, like, say somebody committed, like they murdered somebody and somebody was just, they stole something. They didn't really separate them. I mean, eventually they worked towards that, but they didn't really do that, or by age or gender. They focused on deterrence, punishment, and rehabilitation. They used like social shaming as a means to deter them, as well as punishment. Some people thought rehabilitation would be better. The punishment normally included hard labor, and originally, from what I read, hard labor was meant to both help the institutions to where the prisoners were, but as well to give the prisoners like skills, so when they did get out of jail, they would be able to apply those and not go back to their life of crime, I'm assuming. They had, as you can see in the picture here, the pillory. That was one method of social shaming. The people, mob of people would just pretty much attack them. It was just a free-for-all, pretty much. They also had carting. As well, street prostitutes tended to get harsher sentences as opposed to those who worked in brothels.
So real quick, one of our 3 most important things, the first one was this kind of out of sight, out of mind outlook at prostitution. It was pretty much tolerated as long as it wasn't overtly disorderly, or as Matt talked about, streetwalkers were kind of treated different than actual brothels, but brothels were kind of able to elude police a lot of the time.
Another thing that was interesting is how many actually wanted to be in prison. as it was Montreal, it was very cold. So a lot of them wanted to be in jail for food, shelter, and medical treatment, as Carrie previously had said. The thing is, with the food, they only were given bread and water, and at some point they were also given meat. I think that was the weekdays. By 1840, they were given potatoes, so I guess they really stepped it up, but a lot of women also, if they would, at the court, they would, I guess, petition essentially to stay in prison, because if they're thrown out, they would die. They had nowhere else to go, so sometimes it's just how life revolving around the streets and prison.
Lastly, I want to just talk about the ways like police went about arresting these prostitutes. As I mentioned, they kind of only really arrested the night walkers, and one thing is that arrest rates plummeted during the winter because the guards were taking shorter watch hours because it's cold in Montreal in the winter especially. Brothels were never really raided, like I said, unless there was a warrant, and elites argued that the existence of brothels was not due to defective laws, but to defective law enforcement, which I found interesting.
All right, and to conclude, I will be ending with a direct quote from the book. It says, Montreal women accused of prostitution-related offenses made their own history. They negotiated choices and instituted a range of possibilities that varied according to social class, ethnicity, race, marital status, and individual resilience, as well as individual shortcomings. It was mentioned that there is no single reason women chose prostitution. Even with the criminal justice system, attitudes and practices varied with respect to prostitution, defying a monolithic view of the local state. The disorderly women and keepers of disorderly houses' knowledge of the criminal justice system permitted them to maneuver within it and use it to their own advantage. Work in sex commerce was undoubtedly deemed as dangerous, and the women who chose to be involved in it needed the local state's protection in order to work as safely as possible. Following alleged prostitutes, that law regulated both women's sexuality and sex commerce, which is just sex work. Diving deep into the lives of prostitutes through diverse historical documents from their time gives us a look into their complex lives and relationships. It provides us a lens into their world and the choices they made on how they lived their lives. Thank you, everyone, for listening to our presentation. We appreciate your time and hope that you have a good rest of your day.
So we'll just end this now.